been a rash of news stories about this, how medical marijuana could help end the opioid epidemic. And because this has serious consequences. So here it is in the conservative Newsmax. Tucker Carlson ran it, and what he's saying is not true. Opioid abuse did not plummet. What is true is what this billboard put up by the marijuana industry says. States that legalized marijuana had 25% fewer opioid-related deaths. That is true. And it is based on, there's actually 6 studies I found. There's probably more. They're putting them out all the time. And these studies found that states with medical marijuana laws had 25% fewer overdose deaths, 42% fewer prescriptions, fewer hospitalizations. I mean, it's really dramatic. And I look at that, I go, that would be an amazing result for such a tiny intervention. But if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And all these studies make the exact same mistake, which is correlation does not prove causation. All they have found is a correlation. And a really good study goes out of its way to figure out if there's a third factor. They test all these other confounding factors to see. None of these studies did that. In fact, 3 of these studies were done by this guy, David Bradford, who's printed a very pro-marijuana op-ed, and he actually openly comes to the conclusion that it's causal when there's no evidence that there is. So when 2 things are correlated, it could be, one could cause the other. It could also be pure coincidence. Maybe a third factor causes both. And so I want to just show you that. So here is, the blue line is the divorce rate in Maine. The red line is the per capita consumption of margarine. Highly correlated. This is pure coincidence, I think. I doubt that one causes the other. There's another one. I love this. J. Edgar Hoover once actually said that trailer parks are a major cause of crime. They are not. Substance abuse causes crime. Substance abuse causes people to have poor finances so they can only afford to live in a trailer park. So substance abuse is that third factor or alternative explanation that causes both people to live in trailer parks and to be involved in crime. A really good study on trailer parks and crime would say, we found them highly correlated, but after we adjusted for this confounding factor of substance abuse, the correlation disappeared. J. Edgar Hoover didn't do that. So we have a third factor on the whole opioid overdose medical marijuana thing. And the third factor is the U.S. has, back especially the first decade of this century, an epidemic of fatal overdoses concentrated in whites without a college degree. In fact, particularly non-Hispanic whites without a college degree. That's who was dying of opioid overdoses. And here's a map of the United States showing bachelor's degrees. And the ones with the lowest number of bachelor's degrees are the ones in yellow and really light green. And you can see Nevada's there, but Nevada's highly Hispanic. I'm going to skip Idaho, but all the rest of them are Oklahoma, 7 southern states, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, West Virginia. These are the states with the highest number of non-Hispanic whites without a college degree. And here's a graph, here's a map of the states with the highest number of opioid prescriptions. I mean, look at these. It is, you look at it, it's harder to see in this one, but you look at those states there, it's the same states. And so these are the states with the highest number of opioid prescriptions. It's not caused by marijuana. It's caused because they have high percentage of the non-Hispanic whites who were the victims of the opioid epidemic. What else do we know about non-Hispanic, non-college educated whites is that they tend to vote conservative. And so conservative states are the last states to pass a medical marijuana law. So the reason they don't have medical marijuana laws is also caused by that. So it's a third factor causing both. That's what I want to say about that. So the whole thing is deceptive. You know, they took a trend and they claimed that marijuana caused it, when in fact marijuana has nothing to do with it. But this one has really serious consequences because there are states passing laws saying that marijuana can be used to treat opioid addiction. And I've got patients who believe it. And so this is what we see. And the news media has gone along with this in a really tricky way. They don't come out and say that it works because they know darn well that there's no research saying that. They always pose it as a question. So they say, can medical marijuana help? Can legal marijuana solve the opioid crisis? Hey, we're not saying that it does. We're just asking the question. Is marijuana a secret weapon against the opioid epidemic? But what the public hears is story after story saying pot can help opioid addicts. Here's Charles Koch saying this. Is marijuana the solution? Fox News, could marijuana help treat painkiller addiction? Now, you got to tell you, when so many news outlets do the exact same misleading thing, this is an orchestrated campaign. And this has been a huge media campaign designed to convince us that marijuana can help opioid addiction. And the research shows that this is not true. There's a good study that came out, American Journal of Psychiatry, 2017. Pain patients who used marijuana after several years were more likely to be abusing opioids, not less likely. Opioid abusers who used marijuana were more likely to continue abusing opioids, not less likely. It's the opposite of what they're claiming here. Here's some more studies on this. Women in methadone treatment who use marijuana, 82% more likely to relapse to heroin, not less likely. Patients in opioid treatment who use marijuana, more likely to drop out. So marijuana makes it harder for addicts to get off opioids, not easier. I think it makes, for my patients, it seems to make it worse. I think people do much better off it, and this is what the research shows. I want to bring up another way that marijuana affects opioids, and it's something that is called the gateway effect. A dozen studies have shown that teenage marijuana users are more likely to abuse illicit drugs. Marijuana use always comes first. 96% of illicit drug users start with marijuana. And so what? It's a correlation. It doesn't show causation. And there's very good alternative explanations for this. And so the news media has been very good at saying the gateway drug it's a myth. It's not. And the alternative explanations are marijuana users self-select, and the sort of people who would choose to use marijuana are also more likely to use other drugs, and that is true. Also, marijuana users are hanging out with a bunch of druggies, so they're more likely to be exposed to other drugs, and that is also true. But the gateway effect also has a biological component. And the thing is, you can't take a bunch of 12-year-olds and say, okay, you guys are going to use marijuana, you guys aren't. You can't do that stuff. But you can do it with rats, and it's been done. And so they randomly assign rats, and there's no peer pressure on rats. They're not using because their friends are using. And so they gave half the rats as teenagers, they gave them THC, and the other half they didn't. And then when they grew up, they gave them heroin. And the ones that got THC used more heroin and used it more often. And the view is that it sensitizes the opioid receptors. There's other research that shows that. And this is a problem because we've got 500,000 kids in Canada, the United States, under the age of 16 who are using marijuana. And they run the risk of altering their brains to enjoy opiates for the rest of their lives. And it could play a role in the heroin epidemic. Another study shows that teenage marijuana users are more likely to go into hard drugs. Yeah, we know that's the old gateway story. But it's the teenage users who did it in their early teens, before the age of 14. We've seen that before when the brain development is going through its biggest period. If the problem is that they're smoking pot and they're hanging out with people using other drugs, and that's what gets them into the other drugs, you'd see it more in the older ones, because those are the people more likely to be using other drugs. But we don't. We see it in the very youngest, and these are people who are using when they're usually not exposed to the harder drugs. Some other studies on marijuana and the link to opioids. Fetuses of women who use marijuana during pregnancy have more mu-opioid receptor activity in the amygdala, which is part of the reward pathway. In other words, using marijuana during pregnancy, the offspring are going to be, they're going to have sensitized opioid receptors, more prone to use opioids and enjoy them. And here's the two studies that should bother people the most. Female rats treated with THC as adolescents who mated later had offspring whose brain had a stronger response to morphine. They had more mu-opioid receptors in the nucleus accumbens. I just know that's part of the reward pathway. And this one is even a little worse. Female rats, again treated with THC as adolescents, mated later, had offspring who, when offered, used more heroin. So what it's saying is using marijuana in your early teens could make your children more prone to heroin addiction, at least in rats. We don't know, we don't have a test saying it's in people, but it's, nobody is warning teenage girls about this. And it could play a role in the opioid problem. So there's a lot of things saying marijuana could be could be making the opioid epidemic worse. And you look at this, what caused the opioid pain reliever epidemic? Senator Claire McCaskill put it really easy. She said, this epidemic is the direct result of a calculating sales and marketing strategy by major opioid manufacturers. And I'll tell you, I used to tell patients that opioids do not work for chronic pain. You just build up more opioid receptors, you have the same pain plus you're on opioids. Yes?
You had showed the slide about 3 times more likely to continue with the opiates.
Yes.
Okay. Could you explain the reason then physicians seem to overlook positive marijuana screenings in like MAC clinics?
Lack of information. I worked in a clinic and they told the guy who ran it said, don't talk to people about their marijuana use. This is a trained addiction psychiatrist. It's denial. It's, we used to do this without, I remember, I was a doctor back in the 80s. I was told, don't talk to your patients about their drinking. Talk to them about their real psychiatric doctor. They're wrong. I don't know how else to say it. I mean, I always talk to I've been talking to patients about their drinking. I talk to every single patient about their cigarette use. I talk to patients about their marijuana use, and they're simply wrong to do it. They don't want to argue. I don't know what else to say about them. I mean, the doctor who told me to do this, he ran a for-profit clinic. Didn't want to chase patients away. Anyway, back to what the drug companies did. I used to tell pain patients opioids don't work for chronic pain. In the 90s, there was a huge pressure on us to prescribe opioids for chronic pain. It was in journals, it was in conferences, and it was a lie. Here's this article in Scientific American. I mean, read this. The tragedy of needless pain. Contrary to popular belief, this author says morphine taken solely to control pain is not addictive. Yet patients worldwide continue to be undertreated and to suffer unnecessary agony. This is a scientific expert. This guy was a researcher, and it's a lie. And he was sponsored by the drug companies. So let me be more explicit about what's going on here. What the drug companies did is they paid scientific experts to produce deceptive research that they then used to tell doctors and the public that opioids work well to treat chronic pain when the opposite is true. Right now, the marijuana industry has been convincing scientific experts to produce deceptive research about opioids and marijuana so they can tell doctors and the public that marijuana works well to treat opioid addiction when most likely the opposite is true. I think this plays a role in the ongoing heroin epidemic. My patients, my heroin addicted patients, they either have a family history of addiction or they use pot before the age of 14. That's my experience. I don't know if there's any studies showing that, but okay. Briefly, I want to talk about cannabidiol. Cannabidiol is a non-addictive part of marijuana, and the big problem with cannabidiol is that it almost always contains THC because of the way it's made. If you want pure cannabidiol, you get it from GW Pharma that made a PDLX, or you get it from certain companies that will make pure cannabidiol. But most people who use cannabidiol buy cheaper stuff that has THC in it and shows up positive on drug screens, and it's actually having an effect on them. In some cases, but anyway, it does help. It does seem to help with opioid addiction. So here's a study. Rats were trained to like morphine and cocaine, and then they were given CBD and offered morphine and cocaine, and they lost their interest in the morphine, but not the cocaine, which is pretty cool. I mean, a drug that actually decreases opioid craving. Now note that they use CBD from a bioscience company that makes neurochemicals. They did not get CBD from a dispensary, which contains THC. Here's another study. Absent heroin addicts receive CBD or placebo, and they show them these videos to trigger cravings. An hour later, a day later, 7 days later. And for all 7 days, they actually had less cravings. That's pretty impressive. Again, they use a Pedialex from GW Pharma, not dispensary CBD. They use pure CBD with no THC in it. But when the news media reports on this, that is not what they tell people. So this is about that research. But look what the headline says. A neurobiologist says medical marijuana could solve the US opioid crisis. They don't even mention CBD until the fourth paragraph. They never mention the Epidiolex that was actually used. They keep saying medical marijuana. The news media is really pushing misinformation on this. This happened locally. I called up KJazz. They're down in Phoenix because they ran this whole thing. Could medical marijuana offer promise to treat opioid addiction? They interviewed the person who did one of these studies. The entire story was about research on CBD, not marijuana, but they present it as medical marijuana. The press is using CBD to promote marijuana.